So it's 2:15. We're back from the break. Shannon, I didn't know if you wanted to go over meeting agenda really quick or if we should just get into.
Yeah, I mean, we could take a couple minutes and maybe I won't necessarily hit every bullet, but just to say really that because we have a consistent meeting facilitator, what we're able to do is we're able to have a progressive meeting agenda. And so Debbie, earlier you mentioned that, you know, at the very first meeting, yes, we're going to talk about safety and we're going to talk about the safety reason that brought the case to the department's attention. So that initial intake, whatever brought us to the point of filing the dependency petition. But then we move on, right? And so at every successive meeting, we're talking about what is the safety concern right now, like, or in the last 45 days, what's contributing to safety? What's the current permanency plan right now? Not what was it 6 months ago or 12 months ago, but what is it right now? We're able to work in a progressive manner. We're able to check back in on things that we addressed at the last meeting. So, hey, if at the last meeting we said that term referral was going to go over to the AGO, well, has it happened in the last 90 days? And what's the barrier? Or, if the mother was supposed to get into inpatient treatment, has she done that since the last meeting? And so we're able to really track things and track the progress as things move forward. So it's a progressive agenda. It's individualized to each family. So we're, again, thinking about what's been happening for that family, taking into consideration their culture. And I know that especially when it comes to some of our Native cases, there's some cases that will open meetings with, I think like a Native prayer or something like that. I think Sarah might be on. She could correct me if I'm wrong, what her experience has been, but they're really able to take into consideration the tribal culture. We've obviously talked about alternative plans. This is a big component of our meetings, and then talking about conditions to return home. We've also talked about that a little bit. So we could probably move on.
I was just going to say, when we truly encourage and promote family planning, you're automatically taking cultural considerations into account. You're automatically kind of moving towards away from disproportionality when families are able to be a part of the decision-making process and make those decisions. And families all-encompassing. It could be natural supports that aren't defined by our RCW that defines family, but all of that is really important. So Shannon's going to help me. We're going to move on to concurrent, whoops, hitting the right buttons, concurrent planning. So first of all, terrible word. Like, no one understands really what it means. Even workers, they think concurrent planning means first you do one plan and then after 12 months you switch to another. So I like the term calling it, what's your backup plan? So as a parent myself, if something happened to me or my children's father, we had a backup plan. We'd think about a backup plan in place about where we might want them to go, what we'd like to see happen for them. And this is the approach we take with parents. And this is what we kind of are thinking about. The reason this grant was named Permanency from day one is that we're thinking about this from the very beginning of a case. Because if any of you have been involved in cases that have ended up in adoption or guardianship, you know that if you don't talk about guardianship at the very beginning and you wait 12 months, you're going to be in the system another 2 years, getting things in place to have that happen. And that's the same with adoption or other plans that are different than reunification. So that backup plan is our main road, our main freeway. It's a 3-lane freeway, and reunification is the speed lane we hope we're on. But the other 2 lanes, that middle lane and then the slow lane, are other options that we're thinking about in the very beginning to say, what's our backup plan if they aren't able to make it home? Or if they're home, what's the backup plan if this fails? If this doesn't work out, do we have something we can turn to relatively quickly so we're not leaving youth in care? This all ties into not just this timeliness, the timely outcome, but what research says, which is get youth out of this system. This system is not a parenting system. It's not a healthy system for kids to be raised in. They're different. You're different when you have a worker and a judge and an attorney than everybody else that's growing up in a family system. So what can we look at to, what's different ways that we can look at backup plans and how we can incorporate them into our planning from the very beginning of a case? That's where this name came from. If I could rename the grant, I would now name it Family Engagement Partnership, because that's really where we're running into struggles, because we bring families to the table and we fake listen, but when they have a plan, we kind of say, well, this is what we're going to tell you what you're going to do. So now it's an agency plan or a court plan, or we use court to say, well, the court said this, and this is what you're going to do. And we're really not being open to maybe changing directions or changing our expectation. So let's talk about that for a minute. Really quick. Ryan and I talked a little bit, oh my gosh, my goodness, about how do you assess, like, when it's time, when you feel like parenting has changed? You know, is it really compliance with services? Because I'm going to challenge you, it's not. I'm going to tell you that, and I think Ryan agrees with me on this, but I'm going to tell you that in my experience, I'm just going to go off of that, but I think it's beyond my experience. There have been parents that are really good at sitting through things. They can go to meetings, they can sit through it, and they don't learn a single thing. When you start to talk with them about parenting things, or you ask them to, say, make appointments and show up for their child's doctor appointment, say, that they don't do, but they can sit through a class and do really well. That's compliance versus really internalizing change. And so one of the things that I always like to talk about is your contact with parents, you're assessing and you're reevaluating every contact you have about, are they understanding why whatever it is that started this whole thing was unsafe? And do they have some ideas about how that either could be changed or prevented if it happened again? Let's face it, most of our parents have substance abuse issues. I will tell you right now that I don't care what any parent treatment they go through, there is always going to be a chance to relapse. They may relapse. That's just a fact of life. And what I'm more concerned about is, what's their plan if that happens? Do they have a plan of what they're going to do if they feel like that's going to happen, or if they've made that decision that's going to happen, that's different than what they did when we became involved? So if they're they can articulate that, and if they're demonstrating that, that's important. That's a part of assessing that they've made changes that they can, we can look at reunification. We talk about these things. We see these things in our contact with parents, in health and safety visits, and we're in shared planning meetings. When they're coming and they're talking and they're listening and they're processing and they're sharing their ideas, you can tend to tell from a parent and their idea of, if I do this the next time, or if I have this in place, I feel like this would be helpful and I can safely parent my child. That's a real difference than, I didn't do anything wrong. You're all out to get me. My mom just always wanted this. You know, it's okay for me to carry a gun around when I'm with my kid. Hey, I only hit her once while she was carrying the baby. I mean, those are kind of, like I'm saying, some obvious kind of statements, but you can assess and reevaluate all the time about whether or not a parent is making changes. Visitation is a great place. I'm going to challenge you that reading visitation notes is really dependent upon who's writing the notes and whether they're really objective. I would suggest that you offer parents the opportunity to parent in an environment that is more monitored versus supervised, and see how they do. See, can they do parenting functions while you're, you know, observing, or while you're checking in, or when you're popping in? We used to do, a 4-hour in-home visit, and I'd show up at some random time to see, are the kids alone in the house watching TV? That's really happened while mom was across the street at the laundromat. Or are they all together? Yeah, the kids are watching TV while mom's putting clothes away in the bedroom. And checking on them. So, those are the kind of observations that you can make to assess, is this really taking place? There's a place for classes. Don't get me wrong. I think classes are important, but it's seeing them take what, if you feel like they need parenting classes, and not every parent does need parenting classes. There's not a generic list of everything a parent should do to strengthen their parenting. Some parents that have substance abuse as an issue have awesome parenting skills when they're not using. And they don't really need parenting class. They just need to learn how to stay sober. Or that if they're not going to be sober, who's going to take their kids while they go off and use drugs? And when are they going to come back, and what that's going to look like? So, okay, I'm just looking to see, no questions yet. So when we're looking at considerations for permanency, there's a whole lot of things I like to talk about, and I'm not going to go into each of these, but just suggest to you that we look at family functioning prognosis for return home. We're doing this at every meeting, or really every time that you're kind of thinking about, I'm going to go to court, what am I going to talk about in terms of a recommendation for this family? You're looking at the child or youth's needs for safety, well-being, and stability. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. It's also super important that we're taking into account family and cultural connections. And let's face it, children and youth who can remain with family, remain within their same, their culture or what they're used to in terms of their family life, that's always going to be better for them than going into stranger care with a whole different set of foods and maybe religion and maybe language, neighborhood, and a change in school. All those things is trauma for youth and children and youth. And contribute to the trauma of kind of losing what they're used to. Their Indian and status and tribal recommendations. We always want to know from parents, this is their backup plan. What would you like to see happen? If they can't go home, if maybe it's not that you can't take care of them. We've had parents say, I can't change. I don't think I can do this. What I'd like is for my mom to be able to raise them. But asking what they want and being sure that we take that into account. Acknowledging sibling contact and placement. There's a whole lot of things. What the child or youth wants, if it's developmentally appropriate. The caregiver's preference, this is huge. For permanency, it's a requirement of guardianship that the caregiver agree to a guardianship. That's a legal requirement. So making sure that that's discussed. Looking at visits. And whether visits are appropriate, if they can happen, is there a connection? Whether or not the child or youth is placed with relatives, whether the parent is incarcerated. So there's a whole piece of our law that talks about if our parent is incarcerated, some special considerations that we'll make in terms of either looking at guardianship or reunification. So this is the segue then into reunification. So what we're thinking about when we're talking about reunification, and the very first challenge I want to throw out to this group is managed versus alleviated safety threats. All really big words, but essentially it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Are the parent or parents that we're looking at reunification with, are they able to come up with a plan that manages the safety threats versus having everything perfect and taken care of? So if I've gone to treatment, do I have to be sober for 2 years before you're going to look at reunification? Or is the fact that I've been through treatment, I have a backup plan. This is what, if I relapse, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I agree to do. Is that safe enough are to return home to and have 6 months, because in Washington State, we require 6 months of continued dependency for that return home. Is that enough to say we can return home now? What we're finding, what we're seeing in our meetings is that everybody feels more comfortable with risk, what I call risk-free. There is no risk-free. Just take it from me and Ryan. Ryan agrees with me, I know, on this. He's not shaking his head, but I know he agrees with me. There's always going to be risk, and it's going to come in cases that you never thought you'd see. So I always, when people come back to me and say, I told you there was going to be this problem, I'm always like, hey, did you buy your crystal ball on Amazon? Because I'd like one, because we don't have a crystal ball and we're never going to know. All we can go off of is history and what we're seeing now. So if historically we've seen relapses, you know, what my conversation would be apparent with is, hey, this is your third dependency, and every time you've relapsed and endangered your kids, what can you do beyond just telling me you're going to have the safety plan in place? Like, what are some things we can look at? Or maybe we need to look at that maybe this is too much for you, and what would your backup plan be? You know, really letting parents talk through and think through what's best for their family, and actually expecting and giving them the expectation that they can do that. Because when you give them that expectation, that tends to happen. They tend to be able to tell you their ideas and to come up with other plans. I don't think we've had a meeting yet where a parent said, I don't want to talk about a backup plan. It's been more attorneys and workers that say, no, that's too much. What we've had a parent that said to their attorney, no, I want to talk about a backup plan. I get this. We do a lot of talk with parents about this. Isn't saying we're not going to look at reunification. What this is talking about is we want to move towards reunification, but we also don't want to leave your kids in the system for too long of a time. And if that doesn't work out, what do you want to see happen? And how you can help us make that happen. Parents making measurable progress. Again, that's what we're seeing and hearing from parents, and in visits and in appointments. I mean, a part of this is giving parents responsibilities to parent and seeing how that seeing how they do. Look, Ryan, I can't remember what, I wrote it down somewhere. I think he calls it, and he just went off. So now I can see I'm bringing it up. But he's saying the what ifs. That's what it is. The what if monster. I love that. You can always give a what if. My son used to do this all the time. We'd be in the car and he'd be like, Mom, what if the sky fell down? The sky's not going to fall down. But what if it did? What would happen? Well, we'd be crushed. You can always think of a what if, because we're never going to be risk-free. So what we have to use is reasonable judgment to say, if this looks safe, we need to try it. If this plan can be achieved safely for a child or youth, then we need to give it a chance. If parents are doing what we're asking of them in terms of showing up for appointments, making visits, their visits that we see are going appropriately, then we move it to the next step. They may still be in parenting classes. That's okay. It's if we think that they're showing that demonstrated progress, that they can move forward. And then these cases where we, oh my goodness, keep them in trial return homes for over 6 months. Like, it's never going to be perfect. So I've heard cases where, well, mom might go back to dad. Well, yeah, if mom's going back, she might be doing that now for all we know. I mean, if that's an issue, then we need to talk about how that's not safe and move in it differently. But if that's really not a safety issue and mom's been protected, then we need to get out of her life and let her move on to some sense of normalcy, because it's not normal having us involved. Any comments, questions? It's never going to be easy. I can tell you that. Alice? You have to unmute. I can't, I'm reading your lips a little bit, but not great.
Thank you. I think I love your plan, and I'm on my first case, and I've been at it for 2.5 years, and these children are just now getting back to mom, and it's just been heartbreaking. So I love what you're saying here, and I think the way you're going to administer this with the facilitator is a great idea. Okay, so you have the grant and you're doing this. Now, what if the grant ends? How are we going to fund this? Because I can see, like most good plans, that it's more expensive than the other plan.
You're right. And so, I was talking to Ryan about it because I need him to help me with advocacy, but we do have a sustainability plan, Alice. And it is, but to do that, we have to hire more facilitators in the state to be independent and run these meetings. So we have done, the great thing about this intervention is we've been able to make calculations that nobody else has been able to make. And we believe that a facilitator can be assigned to 50 families. So we looked at, if we had facilitators for 50 families, for every family that has a dependency, and then we also wanted to look at those families who get intakes on them that might go to dependency. We think we need to have these type of meetings where we're bringing everybody in before filing to say, is there a different structure we can use to keep them out of the system? So we took that number in. We have 68 facilitators statewide. We feel like another 50 more would do it. We would be able to make this a statewide intervention to where the facilitators are the center of family planning, and they model for workers, they debrief, they explain to families, they do all the things we're telling you about now, and all meetings are by this one facilitator for the family. So if you, Alice, were assigned to you're assigned to your family, you would know that it's always Shannon who's going to do your meetings, right? And they're always going to be kind of the same format in this same way, regardless of what's going on in the case. And if Shannon's sick, instead of canceling the meetings, Tracy can step in and do the same exact type of meetings because Tracy's trained. And so that's how we do it now. Shannon talked about covering a meeting in Region 6. Shannon's actually from Region 4. Seamlessly, she's able to cover a meeting in Region 6 because all these meetings are run the same way. The information's different. The people, the players are different, but the facilitator's the same and runs the meeting the same way. So that's kind of what we're hoping and how hopefully that answered your question.
Well, I just wonder, how are you going to pay the salaries of these facilitators? That's all I'm asking. Will the state allocate?
Yes, we have a legislative request. We have a request going before the legislature. If we can get it, it has to get approved. So that's it. So I see Ryan has his hand raised. Ryan, you're raising your hand, seriously? But you have to.
Yeah, because I'm really curious, what are some options for permanency that we have for these kids that we're working with? And kind of what are the pros and cons, Debbie, of those options for permanency?
Oh, we're going to get into that. You mean the
oh,
other
good.
option?
I've been waiting.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get into that. So we know that reunification, right, is the best thing for children, youth, and families, is to get them home. But hold on a second. I gotta get my little thing going here. I was going to show you the permanency planning matrix. Hold on here. Does everyone know what the permanency planning matrix is? And have you seen it? That would be my. So let me move it. This is fun. So the permanency planning matrix is something we send out at every meeting to all meeting participants, because this is all a part of knowledge is power. And I'm going to try to make this bigger for you, but everyone needs to know kind of the basics of what each of these plans mean. So with reunification, the permanency planning meeting matrix goes into what this means in terms of legal status, the objective, educational options. We know that there's some questions sometimes about college services and what happens if a youth has been in foster care and is returned home, and it offers links to give you answers to those kind of questions. So I'm not going to do a lot about reunification with this. But I'm going to go to the next one, which is a chapter 13 guardianship. I think this is what Ryan's been on the edge of his seat waiting for, is the guardianship conversation. So when we look at guardianship, we now have two kinds in our state. Somewhat confusing. I'm hoping I can make it easier for you. The first I'm going to call chapter 13. It's also called title 13. It's actually chapter 1336. If you ever want to go in and look at the RCW. But when we're looking at this as a permanency option, we're first of all looking at that reunification is not likely in the foreseeable future. And I'm going to tell you right away that our agency typically defines foreseeable future as in the next 3 months. So a part of that is because we know that we can do simultaneous plans. So you can file for a guardianship while also working on reunification. Reunification should never leave your mind. Even if parents are gone forever, they can always come, or for a long time, they can always come back, and we can actually go, wow, things are changing. We're going to go back to looking at reunification maybe as the primary plan instead of guardianship. But we're looking at them kind of at the simultaneously with reunification, especially in the beginning, being kind of where our head is. But as we go through and parents aren't showing up, or they're not making any progress, what we're thinking about when we're thinking about is a guardianship appropriate is, first of all, is there something about this relationship that's good, that can be positive? Do the parents have a relationship with that child or youth that we can build upon in the future if they get sober, or if they get out of prison, or if they show up? Is there something that we think that can be built upon? And a piece of that with the chapter 13 guardianship is that a visitation plan is built into the guardianship. So that means that is there a visitation plan that can also be healthy and will continue the healthy part of the parent-child relationship. So a chapter 13 guardianship presumes that continuation of that parent-child relationship is beneficial to the child, and that it's beneficial now to the family. So if the caregiver has to agree to a guardianship for either chapter 13 or chapter 11 guardianships to move forward. A chapter 13 guardianship is completed in juvenile court, which means there's no cost to the caregiver. The caregiver does have to have a home study. They can have a relative home study. We're going to talk about RGAP in a minute, which is the subsidy. Okay, so, and that's a great question. So let me get to that about the affordability. So really, without looking at a payment plan, what a chapter 13 guardianship does is when you go into court, and I think Chris brought this up before, filing a termination of parental rights petition, there's 7 points of the law you have to prove for termination of parental rights. For a chapter 13 guardianship, there's 6 points of law you have to prove. The point that's missing is that a termination petition says that continuing that parent-child relationship is detrimental to the child, and the child will not be able to move into a stable, permanent home if you continue the relationship. And a guardianship says that's not true. A guardianship says a child can continue to have some sort of relationship with the parent that's monitored by the guardian, and it won't be detrimental to the child moving on and integrating and having stability. And so that's kind of some of the things that you're thinking about when you're looking at between the two. The biggest being is the caregiver has to agree. So I'm going to get into your question, and Annette, I'm going to pull up this permanency planning matrix again. Have to find where I hit it. And we're going to move into guardianship. And this is the 1336, and I'm going to try to make it bigger for you. And So, and this is available. It's one of the handouts. If you ever come to one of the intervention meetings, you will always have this sent to you. But essentially, a Chapter 13 guardianship ends when the child or youth turns 18. That's something else you need to think about. It is not a lifelong legal commitment. I'm coming in with our gap in a second. Parental rights are not terminated. It can be modified. It's very rare and difficult to do with a Chapter 13 guardianship. The dependency is dismissed. The agency is no longer involved. The family's involved in planning. So if any questions about this so far before I talk about subsidy for Chapter 13 guardianship? Ryan?
Debbie, is this like the old one where you have, in order for the parent to resume custody, like if it's contested from the guardianship, do they have to prove that the guardians are unfit if it's contested?
It depends. If it's contested, you mean if the modification to the guardianship is contested?
Yeah, if I'm a parent, got my act together, my mom still has the kids, I want my kids back. Do I have to prove that my mom, grandma, is unfit for me to get them back, or can I get them back?
So my understanding is that's a really good question, and I don't know that I'm the most well-versed to answer it, but my understanding is that the parent has to show that they've made changes that will allow them to safely parent, and that it won't be damaging to the youth to return back to the parent from the guardian. So
Okay.
it's a higher standard, and I believe it's on the parent, not on the guardian.
It used to be that you had to say that the grandparents were unfit.
Ryan's
On a
right.
Chapter 13.
Yeah, Ryan's right. I'm finding the RCW to put in the chat.
Okay.
Essentially the caregiver would have to be proved incapacitated. And yes, the parent would have to petition with the court. And
There
hi,
you go.
everyone.
Thanks,
Listen,
Sarah.
that's Sarah Cope, and thanks, Ryan. I am wrong.
Takes a village
It takes a village to get the legal part
to
right.
raise a child. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. This
Thank
is Chris. That's what in Mason County we've run into that recently, and that's what the department is basically telling caregivers that when they're trying to decide between guardianship and adoption, that they have to be proven unfit as well as the parent making progress.
So I think I'm coming from a Cowlitz County perspective, where we had several of these overturned because we did not have a finding of the parent as unfit, and the parent went back and said they were fit, and they were able to dismiss the guardianship. And so I think that's where I'm coming from. So I apologize, but thankfully we have Ryan and Sarah here, and Sarah has put the RCW in the chat. So let's talk about RGAP. In our state, in 2010, we did away with state subsidized guardianship state subsidized guardianships or guardianship subsidy. Our legislator said we're not going to fund that anymore. Now that is hopefully changing in the future, but what I can tell you for right now, from 2010 to today, our state legislature said we're only going to allow or approve federally funded subsidies for guardianship. And that is the Relative Guardianship Assistance Program. So the Relative Guardianship Assistance Program has to follow federal guidelines to qualify for subsidy. And they're very strict, they're very restrictive. And so they only allow for subsidies to be approved for if certain things are in place. One is you have to be a relative as defined in your state. Our state statute currently has a very narrow definition of relative. So you have to meet the state's definition for relative. Secondly, according to the federal guideline, you have to be foster licensed. If you're not licensed for foster care, You can have a relative home study, but that's not good enough. You have to have a foster care home study to qualify for subsidy for guardianship. And if you don't have that, you're not going to qualify. The best way to determine if a relative will qualify for RGAP is to have and I have on this PowerPoint, I have the resources of who you would contact to ask, would be to go to your RGAP gatekeeper in the region you live in and ask them if this relative would qualify. That is the best case, because I don't think anybody needs to be the expert in RGAP. It's way too difficult. So let me think, Annette, I want to make sure so you have to be licensed. So that would mean the guardian is not eligible if they're not licensed. That's correct. So we're going to go through some different monetary comparisons in a minute. Let me go to chapter 11 guardianship, just to confuse you a little bit more, believe it not. Who was Chris, or who was?
That was me. Yes, I was going to say, does that mean if the guardian does not qualify, there's no other family members available, these children would have to go into foster care because the guardian would not be able to meet the foster care licensing for RGAP? Because it's a purely financial issue.
And the CSO, the non-needy, what are they getting right now? So they must be getting non-needy.
Well, they do get Social Security, the kids do, because their father passed away. Otherwise, they're not getting any help.
So they would still get that, and they would also get non-needy relative assistance through the community service office.
And they can apply for Medicaid through the community service office.
Right, and they can apply for Medicaid.
Okay. So they would get Medicaid. Maybe they would get Medicaid, but the primary thing is housing, which is usually the case. I mean, she pays $800 a month now, and it's a 1-bedroom apartment, and she can't afford anymore. But it's a loving family environment, and all the relatives live around there. The rents around here are around $1,800 to $2,000 a month, and that's just not feasible.
Annette, is she fictive kin? What kind of placement is she? Is she not a relative at all?
No, she is a relative. It's the aunt.
Oh, then she would, all she has to do is, what's that, Debbie?
Annette just said she's not going to meet licensing requirements. That's why she's not.
Why won't she meet licensing requirements?
Because there's not enough space. They live in a 1-bedroom.
I know.
Oh, so Annette, that's changed. That's why Ryan's making that face, because he's right. That's changed. We have a new kind of fast track for relatives to get licensed. So what might be helpful is connecting that relative with whomever is the licensing division supervisor to chat with them to see if they should do a new home study application, because now they're doing all sorts of waivers. I even have one with a grandma who shares a bedroom with the granddaughter, and she's licensed and she's on the RGAP track. So there are other ways. The only barrier would be if those children were not 4E eligible.
Okay.
For now, Annette, I'll get you a resource that you can contact and put that person. So Debbie, continue on. And
Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No problem.
Okay. No, you're fine. You're fine. So guardianship, chapter 11. Let's see if I get this one right. Again, reunification is not in the foreseeable future. This is our new guardianship law. It's actually, I believe, in the inheritance section of the law. But when we're looking at guardianship of a minor, that's the chapter 11 guardianship. I think it's chapter 11.131. I have it listed here. I shouldn't even have tried to guess. It follows the same, we're looking at the same kind of considerations as we're looking with the chapter 13 guardianship. There's a few differences. This guardianship of a minor, there is a possibility of having the parent retain some decision-making, and that would be positive then for the child or youth, because the court could order that. This guardianship is much easier to modify or dismiss than chapter 13 guardianship. you're going to look again, like the same considerations you're going to have, you're saying that continuing that parent-child relationship is some way is beneficial. The caregiver needs to agree to a guardianship, but not only agree, this is not done in juvenile court. This guardianship is done in superior court, and the guardian is the caregiver, a potential guardian, is going to need to file and provide notice to the parties and essentially establish this guardianship outside of the agency assistance. The AG, our attorney generals, do not assist with establishing this guardianship. Here's what I can tell you. While a home study is required for any dependent youth under the Chapter 13 guardianship, because it's in juvenile court, the caregiver is required to have a home study through the dependency actions. Chapter 11 guardianship is not in juvenile court. And so if you have a relative that does not have an approved home study, but they've had placement, and it's kind of, what do you do next? This guardianship does not require a home study be done on a potential guardian. So let's look at the permanency planning matrix really quick on this. You are able to also qualify for RGAP if you do a Chapter 11 guardianship of a minor. 130, I was going to say 131. I was close. Again, on the permanency planning matrix, it really talks about I'm going the wrong way. Kind of what the legal result is. Both guardianships end when the youth turns 18 unless they're modified. And then if that modification occurs, when we're looking at legal permanency and it's not reunification in terms of legal permanency, adoption is the next most legal permanent option. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Then it would be a Chapter 13 guardianship, and last it would be a Chapter 11 guardianship. So these are things you need to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at options for what you think is best for family, and you're kind of giving your input into the teen planning or talking with parents or caregivers about this. But again, a Chapter 11 guardianship, it's not filed with the dependency court. The proposed guardian is responsible for serving other parties. The parents may retain some decision-making abilities. A guardian can be named, can receive RGAP, but that's only if they're foster care licensed, because the federal rules still apply right now. So if that's the case and they're foster care licensed, they might as well do a Chapter 13 guardianship, and they don't have to do all the serving themselves or the filing. So this really, in my mind, is really for those family members that maybe they haven't had a home study, they haven't passed a home study, but it's not been serious enough to where we've said placement needs to be moved. We certainly don't want those youth raised in our system. So this is something that, I've said to facilitators, we can't recommend as an agency because they don't have a home study, but we've left the youth there for 3 years. This is something the caregiver can do. And there is the possibility of assistance with filing fees and that, but not through the RGAP program. So I want to look at that. So any questions on the guardianship, the two guardianships and the differences? And Shannon's gone, so I'm going to have Tracy tell me if someone does chat for me, because I can't look at it and look at the screen. And Alice, you raised your hand.
I hope I'm not using too much time. Did I understand that once a guardianship is established, if the parents are then come back into the scene and are ready to go, that they have to show that the guardian is incompetent in order to have the children come back to them? That's
for Chapter 13, for a Chapter 13 guardianship, Ryan clarified that and Sarah clarified that for us. For a Chapter 11 guardianship, it's the standard's a little bit different.
But doesn't that make this a constant acrimony? I mean, I wouldn't want to be a guardian and have someone come after me then, after I'd done all this to help this young person and love them and adore them and help them. And then suddenly I have to go back to court and somebody's going to prove that I've been incompetent. Who would want to do that?
Sure, but you
I
have to think about the circumstances around that. They'd have to hire a private attorney. They'd have to have the ability to petition the court and get a court date and navigate the court system on their own. And so the likelihood of most of our families, unfortunately, in the system, it's pretty low that they're going to have the large amount of money that it will take also. It's a pretty permanent plan as far as overturning. And then the other benefit to guardianship that's not an adoption is that in the RGAP and the guardianship, you can name a successor to the guardianship. So it's really a benefit for some of those families that have great grandparents or grandparents, and they've got little kids and they're clearly the best home for them to go ahead and do that. Where with an adoption, it would be like you had to fill out a will and the adoption support would end if you passed away as a caregiver, and the new caregiver would have to file a new adoption petition and also apply on their own for adoption support later. So there's just pros and cons to either one.
And I'm just going to throw in there really quickly, Alice, we do it all the time. It's called divorce.
Right. Well, and the other.
It's a
right,
custody
and-
dispute at that point, right? Like who's got, and then at that point, it really is who's the better caretaker.
I see.
Yep.
The
Okay.
other, but the other
helped
piece
a lot.
is that you really look at those things when you're looking at stability for child or youth. So I hear where you're coming from, Alice, but if we were talking about guardianship and as a group, we all thought that the parent was immediately going to go into court and try to, upsearch the guardian, I would hope that we're sharing that with the guardian to say, look, we think this is probably 90 going to happen. I can tell you in 38 years, when I was a guardianship program manager for 10 years, it happened one time. And the family did say, the guardian did say, I can't handle this. We're being taken into court too much. I'm giving up. But that's one time in 10 years as the statewide guardianship program manager. So, to look at that, and that was also only because the judge continually let the parent come back in, right? So if the parent's supposed to show that there's a reason for them to petition this, right? So while we can't control every variable, you really want to look at what's with the family, what's best. I can't tell you how many times I've heard grandparents say, I just want to stay grandma. I don't want to be adoptive mom. I'm okay with, we're making do with the subsidy that we have. So we have a relative, a caregiver panel that's going to be joining us. And I just want to let you know, we're a little bit delayed. So it's probably going to be about 15 more minutes before we get on. I see Connie here. Thanks, Connie. So about 15 more minutes. Sarah, you've raised your hand.
Thank you.
So the difference between the minor guardianship and the guardianship chapter 13 that I've noticed is that the state does like everything for the chapter 13 and the minor guardianship. I mean, we have a court facilitator who's managing what she managed before, plus all the minor guardianships, but there's no social worker. There's nothing driving it. So we did have a father from out of state file with the help of his dependency attorney. So she pro bonoed hours for a minor guardianship so that he could file a minor guardianship. And now he's not showing up for those court hearings. And so so whether we do 13 or 11, it's just such a huge difference, because I've been through a 13 guardianship too, and that was 3 days of long days of trial that for that guardianship for everything to prove that that was the best route to go, and the state took care of everything. So
right. No, you're right.
I don't know.
Really,
I
the
guess I was just,
Yeah.
it's so
I-
different.
it's a very different process. And like I said, a chapter 11 is really, I would consider it for those cases where relative has had placement for a long time. Everybody thinks it's a great placement, but they're not passing a home study for whatever reason it is. They could do a chapter 11 and it does not require a home study, but they're going to have to do that legwork to get that done or have assistance in doing that. So when we look at adoption, like I said, adoption is the second most permanent legal option. Well, it's actually equal to reunification because it switches, it terminates parental rights and it creates parental rights. It gives us the parental rights to the new adoptive parents. We're going to look at adoption now with the change in our state laws. It's always been when reunification is not likely in the foreseeable future, but now we also have to be able to articulate to the judge when we file termination of parental rights, why guardianship has been ruled out. Why is guardianship not an option? Now, there's a wave of thought always around adoption, and it's been little kids should be adopted and older kids, they can do a guardianship, but you never do a guardianship with little kids. And I'm going to tell you that's not true. That's not in the law, but I'll tell you where I think that comes from. And it comes from because when you have parents that are missing and they're not around, and you have a caregiver that maybe is ambivalent, I don't know if I should adopt or I want to do a guardianship, you're really trying to think ahead of how, for the next 18 years, what is that going to look like for this child? Are they going to have stability in a home where you don't really have a lot of information on parents? Or is it going to be beneficial for them to have that parent and child relationship? And so you really need to be, that's kind of what you're thinking about when we're looking at, should we file termination of parental rights? Is that the step to go? If the caregiver is uncertain, if the caregiver doesn't want a guardianship, if they feel like I really want this permanency, and you believe as a team, the family team, that it would impact the child's integration into a home and their stability if they maintained a real specific court-ordered relationship with their parents, then this is what we would be looking at. Again, that this parent-child relationship is the key difference between a guardianship and termination of parental rights and adoption. Now, adoptive parents have the option to have an open adoption agreement, but they're in control of that, not the court. And so it's really looking at what's best for this family, what's best for this child or youth, stability and integration into a home. And you need to recognize your biases and kind of back burner them, okay? Because lots of times I've heard workers say, oh, but the family, they take them to Disneyland every year and they get to have, 50 Christmas presents. And like, that's not what this is about. This is about connections. This is about family. And if we can maintain some family connection, then that's what we want to do. And that's what we want to try to achieve with what we can do. When we look at the permanency planning matrix, I'm just going to look at this really briefly for adoption, is the fact that it is, did I pass it already? Probably because I'm in big mode. It provides permanency. It does not end ever when the child turns 18. It is a permanent option. And something else that's different from guardianship in our state is that anyone who adopts a dependent child is essentially going to qualify for adoption support. We have a federally funded adoption subsidy program and a state funded adoption support program. So if you don't meet the federal requirements, there's a state program that will qualify you and that you will be able to receive a subsidy and medical care. So really quickly, I'm going to show you two things that we have as attachments that are awesome comparisons. So we also send these out with permanency planning to our permanency planning meetings because they're great comparison. One is a comparison of adoption and guardianship for children in relative care but it really works for any kind of care. And it tells you kind of what are my legal rights and responsibilities? What happens with the birth parents' rights? I don't know if you've seen this before, but if you've been in one of our meetings, this is something that we regularly send out. And I've sent it to Ryan as an attachment. Can I change the child's last name? Can I move out of state? Yes, you can move out of state in a guardianship. No, you don't have to stay licensed in a guardianship. Those are two of the most commonly asked questions I get. And then the other handout is Chapter 1336 versus a Chapter 11.130 guardianship. And this probably would have answered Ryan's question if I'd have just looked at it. But it is the more legal aspect. This is completed by our court partners on what's the difference between the two guardianships. Again, we're not expecting families to come to meetings and be experts in this, or caregivers to come to meetings and be experts on this. But this helps provide a guide. Sorry, and our facilitators are experts on this. This is what happens when I talk nonstop. I'm going to pause for a minute. But this comparison also gives you kind of answer some of the more court questions. Whether or not you need to have a background check, it's just really well versed in kind of what's needed. So I've done a comparison study for you guys, our comparison in the PowerPoint also. That's kind of the most, and I put all three together. So just really briefly, for legal, in either guardianship, parental rights are not terminated on guardianships, but they are terminated in adoption. It's a lifelong legal relationship that cannot be modified by court, but the two guardianships can be modified. In 11.130, the parents may retain some decision-making ability. In visitation, guardianship, Chapter 13 guardianship requires visitation. In a Chapter 11, the court may set up visitation or may not. And in adoption, it's really up to the adoptive parents. In all, the dependencies end. The legal relationship ends in a guardianship when the youth turns 18, unless it's modified, but it never ends in adoption. I think it was either Alice or Annette who pointed out, or no, maybe it was Sarah that's done a guardianship, Chapter 11 guardianship. There's possibly fees involved for the guardian with that, but there's no fees involved for a Chapter 13 guardianship. With an adoption, if there are fees, attorney's fees are required by the adoptive applicant, but they're reimbursed through adoption support. Talk about the home study I've already talked about. And then our financial services available. For a Chapter 13 guardianship and a Chapter 11 guardianship, there's two avenues. The relative guardianship assistance program, you have to be foster licensed. You have to be a relative as determined by state statute. And it has to be a federal 4E eligible case, a Title 4E case, or it will not meet the requirements. The other option is through the Community Service Office, a non-needy relative assistance grant. Social Security can also go to the guardians if the children or youth are qualify for Social Security. And then with adoption, as I said, it's reimbursed through adoption support. Medical assistance, it's the same way. It's either RGAP or the Community Service Office. And for adoption, it's for adoption support. Any questions? Ryan, is there anything you had that I didn't cover before we get into the relative?
I have a question. Can you negotiate, let's say you have a high needs medical child being guardian and the department is pushing guardianship? Can you negotiate like you would an adoption support piece in a Title 13
You can
situation.
negotiate the RGAPs. So if the relative potential guardian qualifies for RGAP, you
Beyond
negotiate.
RGAP.
Pardon me?
Beyond RGAP.
So if they don't qualify RGAP, there's no other subsidy available.
No, I mean beyond RGAP. Let's say it's a highly needy child.
It follows the adoption support requirement. So you can't go above 90%. So depending on the age of the child or youth, but the most you're going to be able to get is 90% of foster care maintenance fees. So it could, and depending on, and that's depends on the age. So it could be less. I think it goes 0 to 5 is like 80 or 85%. Sarah Cope, are you still on? You might remember.
Yes, I know. 0 to
Okay.
5 is 80%, a max of the reimbursement rate. So also remember there's a rating system. So if we have an extremely like a total care or super medically fragile kid, they may be a level 4. So that's like a 80% reimbursement of that. Then 5 to 11 is 90%. And then 11 to 17.99 is 95%.
So, but the relative would not be eligible for those subsidies if they were pursuing guardianship versus adoption, because I hear that all the time where you negotiate what, you know,
RGAP's negotiated.
Yes.
RGAP
Yeah.
can be negotiated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You just can't negotiate
Yes.
over the percentage because it's a federal
Right.
program and we can't, and they get audited every year and they can't give more money than the federal limit.
Yeah. The
There-
subsidies
yeah.
themselves follow the exact same rules, Ryan.
Right.
So, but the problem is adoption support is open to everybody and RGAP is open to a subset that's very restrictive right now.
I want to be super clear about this because I have heard this different ways. So there's the standard RGAP, right? So is that 80 and 90% that you're talking about,
Yeah.
Sarah? Is that above
Yeah,
and
that's
beyond?
the standard RGAP. That's the
That's-
standard RGAP.
So
it's the
there's
same.
just RGAP, is what you're
Yes.
telling me.
Yes.
So if I've got a high needs kid that is going to need a lot of support for the rest of their life, guardianship is a stupid idea. I need to go to adoption because that's where I'm going to get.
It's essentially the same benefit
same.
though.
It's not going to
What's
be
all
any
that stuff
different.
that they
than-
talk about where they're negotiating adoption supports and stuff like
They
that.
negotiate RGAP subsidy also.
I'll be really
Yeah.
honest with you,
Yeah.
Ryan. Typically with RGAP, we just give the most. When I was a guardianship programmer,
Yeah.
I used to give the most. And adoption support, it's probably more of a negotiation to get to the most.
Yeah.
And with RGAP, we just said, here's the most we can give you. Is that enough? So they're
Brilliant.
both negotiations. Unfortunately, I hate, but I'm just telling you the truth. I don't know if that's still what they're trying, but that's how when I did guardianship, I just said, let them know the most that we can give, and that's what it would be. So, but it follows the restrictions that adoption support has, so that
Okay,
the tiers that Sarah said, and then the level 4, and we can't go beyond that.
that
Yeah.
makes sense. Is level
Yes,
4
Sarah.
the max? Sorry, one more question. Is
Yeah,
level
level
4 the
4 is the
max
max.
RGAP? Okay.
Yeah,
No, it's the max rate.
Okay.
Kids are
Yeah.
basic rate would be called level 1, and then there's level 2, 3, and 4 based on supervision needs and
Got it.
how much. I mean, there are parents, foster parents, and relatives that are spending a lot of money out of pocket to care for our kids, and so it's compensating for that. So
Perfect.
my
Okay.
frustration, I'll be real honest with this, with both, but really with guardianship is, we have relatives go through the whole process, they get licensed, they get the maximum amount of money, and then we say, well, now we want permanency, will you do a guardianship and take less money? It's like,
Because it's that gap, that 10% gap that you guys are all talking
that
about.
we have to do, yeah. We can never give them 100%, neither program can give 100%.
Why don't you put that in the state request, the DP for the,
I've argued it. I'm
you guys should
telling you.
talk.
Yeah, I know, right? So I'm just telling you, being very transparent, I've always talked about this, how unfair it is. Like, really, now you're finally getting all the money that you need and more to care. And now we're telling you we need to do permanency and we're going to cut it back. Why would you want to do, just be like, hey, I'll just stay in the foster care system. I'll get all this money, right? Sarah, sorry.
That's what we're dealing with one of the cases is high need in a wheelchair part of the time. It's probably level 4. He's been in for over 5 years now in the foster care system. Parents' rights were terminated a while back. And he is completely bonded to this family. and this family is there with him through, but they can't afford not to receive all of the services. I mean, they say anywhere from $6,000 to $7,000 worth of services every month.
So he
And-
should be receiving all of that through Medicaid and coordinated care. And then there are separate funds that Debbie's well aware of through headquarters that if there's a one-time cost, so I'll give you a really good example because I'm a former adoption worker. So for a one-time cost, I had a total care kit. I mean, he had a lot going on and his caregivers were spending their own money, paying for some of the prescriptions that coordinated care was arguing with Medicaid that needed to happen. And he needed 24-hour care. Medicaid pays for the majority of that. There are things like building a ramp, they needed tie-ons so that when he got heavy enough, the wheelchair could lift into the van. Now, those are one-time costs that are something that the department can look into because we do have
we know about the
specialized
one-time
funds for that.
costing.
Yeah.
The thing is that it's the BRS services, the WISE services, all these services that are there to take him, all over the place. They're, I don't know if they're with him at school too, but they haven't been able to find anything comparable enough to adopt him, even though they want to adopt him.
And BRS services are typically, are they a BRS home?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's another thing too. If it's a BRS there, that's like a whole different
There
discussion.
As Sarah's saying though,
Yeah.
there are monies now that if there's a barrier to permanency, that we can ask to use.
And we did, we went,
Okay.
we got that form
Mhm.
and we got another form too. And went to adoption and they said that there's not the funding for ongoing. It would just be,
Okay.
It's a one-time.
it would be like
it's a one-time
roof
reimbursement.
or a ramp
Mhm.
or I mean,
Yeah.
Right. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna move this on because I have a
Yep.
panel here that I want to be sure we share their lived experiences with. But really quickly, I've got the experts of who can answer your questions.
oh, I'm sorry.
Hey, this is who you need to go to with your specific questions. If you have questions about RGAP, there's a regional RGAP leads. If you have questions about what adoption support would cover, or you feel like it needs to cover more, here's the 2 adoption support leads. If you have questions overall about the adoption process or guardianship, here's the 2 program managers, Julie and Jeannie, who oversee that. Skylar, okay, I think Skylar is asking, what does Region 1 cover? So Region 1 is Spokane County, north of, I don't know all the counties in Eastern Washington, but north of Spokane County, kind of to Moses Lake.
There's a map. I just posted a map, Debbie.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. Oh
You're
my gosh,
welcome.
because I'm horrible with geography. Region 2, I always think of as Yakima, the Tri-Cities. Region 3 is up north. That's Snohomish County. Region 4 is King County. Region 5 is Pierce County. And is Bremerton and Pierce County? Or does it have
Kitsap,
its
yep.
own? Kitsap, thank you, Ryan. And then Region 6 is
The peninsula down to
Thurston
Vancouver.
County.
Yes.
Yeah, from Olympia all the way down to Vancouver. So let me tell you this. If you contact the wrong RGAP, they're still going to answer your questions. I promise. They'll still answer your questions. They'll put you in contact with the right person. So these are the experts. So you don't have to remember all these qualifiers for RGAP or what does or doesn't cover. Go to the people that know the information and they'll help guide you with that. So I know we've been on for a bit, but I really am excited because we have some caregivers. One of them, unfortunately, had a caregiver issue their babysitting issue, so they couldn't come. But I think Connie, Kristen, and Kim, I know Connie and Kim. Kristen, are you here? Kristen's here. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. So I just wanted to have them share with you kind of their experience in working with the system and the communication and coming to these and being involved in shared planning meetings. And not all of them have come to the intervention shared planning meetings. Kimmy, I believe, has been to the non-intervention shared planning meetings, but not the ones in the intervention. But I will say that Kimmy actually is also a state employee, so she works with the agency, but she's also here as a relative caregiver. So Kristen, let's start with you and just kind of ask for your expertise in sharing kind of, have you participated in shared planning meetings? What's worked well for you? What has been your experience?
Yeah, so I have been a foster parent for 4 years. I had one placement that we did not do these meetings with, and then my other placement and now his sibling is part of the intervention. So we've been participating in these shared planning meetings for almost 2 years now. And I think what I feel like they've done differently in this situation than my previous experience has really been opening up that communication between the foster parents and the biological parents, because we're all in a room together talking about the child. So it gives us the opportunity to really communicate the needs of a child. I think back to my previous placement where it's like everything would go through the social worker. And so things would just get lost in translation because people are human, right? So it's like, what formula are they on? How much are they taking? Like, what are the medical needs? Like all of that fell on the social worker to have to be that mediator between the foster parent and the biological parents. And you don't have to do that in this situation because we're in a Zoom room together. So we're able to give that information that I feel is extremely helpful for the bio parent to have. And then they're able to ask me any questions as well. And then it also really allowed us to set up extra visits, right? So opportunities for the kiddos, and my experiences with young infants, but the kiddos to be in a room with both the foster parents and the biological parents, which is just so important for kids to have that experience, to see we're all on the same page, we're all getting along. It makes them feel better supported. So these meetings really, because that connection was there, has allowed us to do those extra visits, get grandparents some visitation time, which often doesn't happen in the system, and really just build that bridge between the two sets of parents. And just as me selfishly, we get to hear a lot more about where the case is at in these meetings than what you do outside of them. So you can get a more clear timeline, better. So it sets your expectations better as a foster parent to feel like you are in the know a little bit more. Obviously, they don't get into all the specifics around services and those details while I'm on the call, but just to get a general idea of where things are at rather than just the court dates that are every 6 months or whatever.
Oh, thank you, Kristen.
Yeah.
Connie, would you like to share kind of what's worked? I'm assuming, have you been to shared planning meetings, and what's worked well for you and what has not worked well for you?
Mine's almost a complete opposite. We've had several children come through. Not once have I had at meetings with the parents have attended. Our social worker has not really provided information as freely as we feel they should. We recently had a meeting for a change in placement, and the other foster parents were unaware this was going to happen. They were very upset. I mean, unless you're given the information, you cannot help a child in their care. I'll say it before and I'll say it again. We are not 15-year-old babysitters for the day. We're with these children 24/7, and we need information. We need to know what's going to come, what's going to happen down the road, what may have happened in the past, to do the best we can for the children in our care. I think we need much more communication for foster parents. We don't have, in my case, I don't have a mother who recently became deceased, and the social workers left it for me to tell the child. And that was a little rough. It was the day before their birthday. And I think that social worker could have told me, especially when we found out that the mother had passed away almost a full month in advance. Those are the type of things that we need to know.
Tough. Yeah,
I mean,
you're right.
Not the day before.
It does show the importance of communication.
It should have been immediately. The communications need to go out all the time, not just once a month when you see them. It needs to be continual.
Right. Thank you, Connie. Kimmy, have you attended shared planning meetings, and what's worked? If so, what's worked well and what has not worked well for you?
Hi, everybody. So I have in my job attended both style meetings, the business as usual and in the PFD1 intervention. So I'm very familiar in that regard. As the relative caregiver with my family, at this time, the meetings that we participate in are not through the PFD1 intervention. So they're the business as usual. And my experience as a caregiver in those meetings, it's been pretty traumatic. And if it's traumatic for myself as a social worker who understands some of these things just in general, I could only imagine how traumatic it's been for the parents of my nephews in these meetings. I looked at your questions, Debbie, ahead of time, and what's worked well so far in these business as usual meetings, not much. And it's really tough for me as part of the system in my job to then be on that other receiving end and experiencing that. What's worked well is what has worked well is that we have been invited. Positive, that we have been invited. What hasn't worked well for us in those meetings is that none of us, whether it's myself or my mother, a caregiver as well for our family, or the parents, are being contacted prior to the meeting to be explained, to be talked to about what the point of the meeting is. We're been given the information that here's the day and time, Zoom link, we're having this FTDM, we're having this shared planning meeting. And that's the extent of it. And so I've seen my family come into those meetings not understanding what's going to be talked about really, except for that, well, it's obviously about my kids because we're in this dependency. But not knowing what the basic, what the ultimate goal is in that meeting. And I've seen them be blindsided then by the information that's shared by the social worker or the department, and that we've been on that end of the experience where it's not the coming together to come up with a plan together. It's been the experience where the department has come into that meeting already having a plan, which has been it's been disappointing to be in that situation. I think that the most so this was it's really difficult for me to participate in. We had a meeting where a supervisor screamed at my brother in that meeting, and I mean screamed. And the facilitator didn't intervene, the social worker didn't intervene, and I was in I didn't know what to do either, and my brother didn't know what to do. He was being told not to talk, and his question was pretty typical from what I hear folks, parents, not maybe question, but sometimes a statement being made, well, you really don't care about my kids. Oftentimes that's what parents feel, they don't know that social workers do care about their kids. They just have that feeling. And that was his feeling in the moment. And he expressed that, and he didn't express it in a aggressive way. It was just something he shared. And in our experience in that meeting, that supervisor retaliated, screaming at him that he had no right to say that to him, and was told that he wasn't going to be allowed to talk. And that was the meeting where they determined they would file dependency. So this has been pretty traumatic experience for us in these meetings. And as a worker and my position being able to be a facilitator in the PFD1 intervention has just so different. I've never seen in the meetings I've been in the intervention what I've seen happen in my experience recently as a caregiver and being on that other side of the table and experiencing that with my family. And I can tell you that it has forever changed my lens as a social worker in child welfare and how I will go forward professionally in that matter. But it's also been super traumatic for us as a family. So.
Kimmy, thanks for sharing.
I was just going to add, I'm always gobsmacked by the way the department messes up even just taking care of its own people. Like I was having the same issue too, like with some of our staff, you know, like there's connections that they already have and you kind of want to say, and I get this, but it's kind of this like, do you know who I am? Like, why are you choosing to act this way? I've just never understood that. So go ahead, Kimmy. Sorry.
Yeah, I just, and I'm sorry, I have my screen set up, so I don't know who just shared, but it doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter that I'm a social worker and I know what's supposed to happen, because I do know what's supposed to happen, but that doesn't matter. That shouldn't happen to any family.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hi. And I don't mean not to, you would think maybe they would be more on their toes because they know.
No, that's my point, right? Like
but then at the same degree, you know, if you work in a different area, they may not really have realized that, you know, but that's no family should experience that from us as professionals and social workers and people who are here to help and to be that was not a trauma-informed meeting. And
you speak out. If you speak out, you get punished.
It was I felt very shameful as a social worker after I left that meeting, and very sad for my brother's experience. And again, that was the meeting they decided to file. And there was I love PFD1 meetings. I love them because a facilitator is, I feel, very neutral in those meetings and can bring about questions that give the family an opportunity to offer solutions maybe, or to help construct that plan. And it's wonderful. And I really hope that this continues on, because all families in our system, all families deserve this. Because it was the most horrible experience that I've gone through as a individual to see that occur. So, but I love PFD1 meetings.
Kimmy, well, I want to say, first of all, I want to acknowledge your honesty and your vulnerability and being honest, and that I appreciate your willingness to do that. So, and all the panel members can say, like, I didn't bring them on to talk up this intervention, but I'm going to tell you my experience is it naturally happens because we really are geared to a different focus. In fact, what I really wanted to hear from you was what I'm hearing from you, all three of you, is your different experiences within the system and around this communication, because I really believe that communication is like that underlying factor in how we're going to make change, how we're going to support families change, how we're going to support caregivers. And I think, Connie, I'm just going to go back to you really quickly, because I think you were talking about kind of feeling like you're on your own. It sounds like you were on your own in having to share some real, like, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to have to share information about a death of a parent with someone in your care that's that's would be hard for anyone to do, much less a caregiver that I don't know how long the child has been in your home, but I would ask you, Connie, what kind of recommendations you would have to improve partnership with caregivers as a whole, between this agency, with court advocates, like anyone on the family team. What would you suggest? What recommendations would you have to improve our partnership?
It has to be communication. You have to share as soon as you know something, send it out. Court dates, updates on the parents, where things are standing. Everybody has to be on board. Everybody has to be respected. I guess I'm in a unique position. I have adopted. I'm also legal guardians of my adult nephews, and we are fostering yet again. So I have seen all sides of this that's going on. It's hard. You know, if you do speak out and you want to stand up for something, you feel like you're being punished. You shouldn't have to pull information. You shouldn't have to beg. And when something is not working, it needs to be heard as well. If you have a child in your home that you cannot help, that it's above and beyond your skills or your abilities, instead of saying, well, let's have a meeting, it needs to be, what can we do immediately? Not a week from now, not 5 days from now. It needs to be very proactive, and it's not. And it's unfortunate. I've talked to other foster parents who want to quit. They're saying, I get nothing. I get nothing from my workers. I get nothing, no support. We're with these kids 24/7, and we don't have a voice. Nobody's listening to us. And it is frustrating.
So it sounds like communication is the underlying thing, but really feeling like you're part of the team, and being a part of the team would be that you're listened to, that your needs are acknowledged, what you need as a caregiver for youth in your home, and that you're made to feel valued. Also, your opinion's valued, your needs are valued and supported. It's kind of what it sounds like. Kristen,
Well, and it's not just yell services. I mean, they yell, we'll send it to Weiss team. We'll send it over here. I think they're just pushing it off instead of actually facing what needs to be faced. Some of those, oh, we'll send a referral. We'll send a referral. And the referral people say, well, they don't qualify, or it's not enough, or it's not, it has to be more than just, we'll send a referral. We'll just have a meeting. It needs to be communication.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank
Kristen,
you.
what would you suggest as recommendations to improve partnership with caregivers, either our agency?
I think I've just been very lucky in having great social workers and honestly very communicative and supportive bio families that take what I say as a foster parent and hear it and want to work with us. And so I've just been very fortunate, and I feel for you, Connie, and I know that there's so many foster parents that there's much more on your side than are experiencing what I'm experiencing. So just to say that, but I would say the permanency from day one meetings, just having them has been incredibly helpful in facilitating those conversations. And Sarah, our facilitator who was on earlier, she is great about making sure everybody knows about them and tries to get everybody there. And sometimes when parents fall off or whatever happens in between those 3 months, these are like the times that we're able to like reset and to get back together and on the same page. So those have been very helpful. The one thing that I will just say that I've had, it's a little bit of a weird dynamic for a foster parent when everybody else has an attorney but you. And I'm not saying that foster parents need to have attorneys, but it's a very strange environment. And when you're participating in this intervention, you have a lot more attorney contact than you do if you're not part of the intervention, right? So I have felt like I've been put on the spot a little bit by attorneys in these meetings without having like my own time to process something or get legal representation or something like that. So making sure that we're feel very empowered to say, I'm going to have to think about that. Or in our situation, DCYF staff were great about stepping in and saying, like, that's not a decision we can make right here in this moment. So that part was great too. But it's just a little bit of a quirk to the meetings and the process that I just wanted to call out.
I appreciate that, Kristen, because I've heard like we're in a meeting and a caregiver gets asked, well, do you want to do adoption or guardianship? And maybe you haven't even read what's been sent to you lately, and you're just kind of like, and it, what I've said to facilitators is, let's remember to remind people, decision doesn't have to be made today. Like, give a caregiver time to go out, to go do some research, to maybe talk to court advocate, guardian ad litem, maybe your own attorney, maybe the worker some more, maybe the RGAP person. I mean, talk to people that can answer your questions so that you're well informed to come back and say, okay, I've thought about this, talk to my partner, talk to my family. This is talk to the youth, not a baby, but and this is what we decided to do. So really well taken.
Yeah, but it's not always the facilitator. Sometimes attorneys are really pushy to get that answer. So it's certainly on everybody in the room to acknowledge that we don't need to make decisions in that.
Right. No, I would guess it usually comes from the from the attorney, but I've asked facilitators to kind of take control of that and say, wait a minute, we don't have to do that. So that's good. Or if workers do that, that's great too. Mm-hmm. So Kimmy, you've kind of said this, but please let us know what you think, like recommendations you have to improve our partnership.
I like Connie and Kristen have talked about too, and I'm so happy you've had good experiences, Kristen. The communication, just the explaining what a meeting is going to be about, I think can alleviate a lot of angst and worry for parents on what are they coming into. So, when they know that there's a meeting, but what is that meeting going to be about? And nobody's really telling them. And sometimes they're afraid to ask what that meeting's about. But having somebody that can explain and communicate to you, what that's going to look like, what the environment's going to be, what would be some of the questions that might be asked. What is the ultimate goal in the meeting? I think that alleviates a lot of stress for parents and families going into those meetings. I also think that involving the family supports and relatives in case planning is really important. Even though sometimes parents don't want those non-legal parties there to hear their specific services, which they have always, they have that right, but giving the family still an opportunity to maybe say or share an idea that they have or a contribution that they can give. And because maybe that's the only forum that the parent comes to and where that relative come to. And maybe that's the only place they have an opportunity to say, I love you, sister, and I want to help with this. And so those meetings can also be very, what is the word? Maybe healing. Never mind. Healing in some ways. And then yes, parent might still want that sister to leave, and that's okay. But
I do see what you're saying, Kimmy, about healing, because sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I was just going to say, I'm back from the day when foster parents used to want to come to the back door because they didn't want to be seen by. This was when I was first supervising. They didn't want to be seen by parents at the front door. And then we'd bring them into meetings and everybody would find out that nobody was really wearing horns, that we're all human beings with our flaws and our good parts. And we've had, I've been in meetings where foster parents have cried because we've made the decision was made in the meeting to terminate parental rights, and where parents have gotten choked up and hugged foster parents when the decision was made for reunification. And you humanize, and there is some healing that goes on that can happen in these meetings when they're respected and they're inclusive and they're, and that every partner caregivers are treated like an equal member too. So
can I just say one more thing?
100%.
Just, I think that, and I love the Zoom world with this respect, but having your camera on makes such a huge difference if you're on the other side to be able to see who you're talking to and to see that that person, if it's your social worker or if it's the facilitator for a meeting, that that person's engaged with you, and that can really make a difference in feeling heard or listened to and things. So I know that's not always possible for lots of different reasons, but I think if as much as possible, some of those people in the meetings, like the attorneys and the social workers, that helps make parents and family feel like they're being engaged, you know. So
Sorry for being triggering, Kimmy.
triggering.
I was hiding and you're like, who's saying that?
No, I totally. I just noticed that. I noticed that being on the other side, that I'm sorry, I just have noticed things that I didn't notice before. So.
Anyone else have any questions for the panel? Or I really appreciate the three of you for coming and your honesty and willingness to share. I'm going to say that to all three of you. I said it to Kimmy, and but I mean it for all three of you. And I appreciate your insight. And Alice, you have a question?
I just want to say how much I appreciate this sharing. It's not easy in front of a large group of people, and you've all been so forthcoming. Also, I mean, I'm very new at the job I'm doing, but I sure have had this same, especially what you said, Connie, that foster parents are not, because they don't have legal representation or aren't legal parties or whatever, they never get any information. They're not told anything. They're not helped in a way that, who's taking care of these children anyway? Do you not want to help them so that they can do a better job taking care of those children? And I feel that they've been, I can't imagine why anyone in the state of Washington is a foster parent. That's how I feel about it after being a GAL for these years. They are so disrespected. They're so mistreated. I really feel strongly on the subject, and I just want to say thank you so much for that sharing. It meant so much to me.
I have yet to have one GAL or CASA come out for any of my kids that I've had come through here. So that was a rather surprised. I did have one when my daughter was an infant before we adopted. But out here in Westport area where we're at now, I haven't had a CASA. I haven't had an attorney for the kids, kind of floating around on my own. And it is difficult when you don't have anybody to reach out to who's supposed to be speaking out for your kids. You don't have that extra party on your side. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, and I have to say
Anyone
with my kiddos, they did get CASAs, but at like the very final hour. It's not like they were there throughout the whole case. It's more of a coming in at the very end. And I know that there's just a huge shortage in CASAs right now, but their voice is just so beneficial to have at the table. And it feels like as a foster parent, until that connection gets made, you're serving that purpose as that advocate, but you have no legal right to serve that purpose. So nobody cares that you're trying to fill that void. So you need that CASA to come in. And there's just such a shortage that it makes it really hard.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you all. Anyone else have any questions about the materials available to you through Ryan? I appreciate the panel. Sorry, I was 15 minutes over. I'm going to blame Shannon because she wasn't around. It's all her fault. Not really. But I really appreciate your time, and I'll get back to each of you afterwards just to kind of debrief with you, see if there's anything else you wanted to say or share for our panel members. So thank you all for coming. Ryan, I appreciate your time and letting us talk. If there's any questions that come up, feel free to reach out to me or someone on my team or the experts that I included in the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone.